Am I live? Live. What was going on? Am I live on? Looks like it. Making sure I'm on. Ugh. Alright. Alcohol. Pouring alcohol. We were in the section Modern Alternative Theories of Liberty, so we're quite close to the end. Quite an endeavor. We finished the chapter Isaiah Berlin and the Isaiah Berlin on negative liberty. We got Hayek and Nozick left. Let's just this out. Like, let's see. Okay, yeah. Making sure that I had read that part. And I had. Once. I need to retitle the stream. Oh well. I'm gonna switch to writing at some point. It was a bit awkward though. So, F.A. Hayek. Actually, let's get going. Volume there. That's probably a good volume. It's quieter than I am. That's the most important. In his monumental work, The Constitution of Liberty. In his monumental work, The Constitution of Liberty, F.A. Hayek attempts to establish a systematic political philosophy on behalf of He begins very well by defining freedom as the absence of coercion, thus upholding negative liberty more cogently than does Isaiah Berlin. Unfortunately, the fundamental and grievous flaw in Hayek's system appears when he defines coercion. Or, instead of defining coercion as is done in the present volume, as the invasive use of physical force, the threat thereof against someone else's person or just property. Hayek defines coercion far more fuzzily and inchoately, as control of the environment or circumstances of a person by another, so that, in order to avoid greater evil, he is forced to act not according to a coherent plan of his own, but to serve the ends of another. And again, coercion occurs when one man's actions are made to serve another man's will, not for his own, but for another's purpose. For Hayek, coercion, of course, includes the aggressive use of physical violence, but the term unfortunately also includes peaceful and non-aggressive actions. Thus, Hayek states that the threat of force or violence is the most important coercion, but they are not synonymous with coercion. So the threat of physical force is not the way in which coercion can be exercised. What then are the other non-violent ways in which Hayek believes coercion can be exercised? One is such purely voluntary ways of interacting with a morose husband or a nagging wife who can make someone else's life intolerable unless their every mood is obeyed. Here, Hayek concedes that it would be absurd to advocate legal outlawry of sulkiness or nagging. But he does so on faulty grounds that such outlawry would involve even greater coercion, but coercion is not really an additive. How can we quantitatively compare different degrees of coercion, especially when they involve comparisons among different people? Is there no fundamental qualitative difference, a difference in kind, between a nagging wife and apparatus of physical violence to outlaw or restrict such nagging? It seems clear that the fundamental problem is Hayek's use of coercion as a portmanteau term to include not only physical violence, also voluntary, non-violent, and non-invasive actions such as nagging. The point, of course, is that the wife or husband is free to leave the offending partner, and that staying together is a voluntary choice on his or her part. Nagging might be morally or aesthetically unfortunate, but it is scarcely coercive in any sense similar to the use of physical violence. Only confusion can be caused by lumping the two types of action together. But not only confusion, but also self-contradiction. For Hayek includes in the concept of coercion not only invasive physical violence, i.e. a compulsory action or change, but also certain forms of peaceful, voluntary refusal to make changes. Surely the freedom to make an exchange necessarily implies the equivalent freedom not to make. Yet Hayek dubs certain forms of peaceful refusal to make an exchange as coercive, thus lumping them together with compulsory exchanges. Specifically, Hayek states that there are undeniably occasions when the condition of employment creates opportunity for true coercion. In periods of acute unemployment, the threat of dismissal may be used to enforce actions other than those originally contracted for. And in conditions such as those in a mining town, the manager may well exercise an entirely arbitrary and capricious tyranny over a man to whom he has taken a dislike. Yet dismissal is simply a refusal by the capital-owning employer to make any further exchanges with one or more people. An employer may refuse to make such exchanges for many reasons, and there are none but subjective criteria to enable Hayek to use the term arbitrary. Why is one reason any more arbitrary than another? If Hayek means to imply that any reasons other than maximizing monetary profit are arbitrary, then he ignores the Austrian school insight that people, even in business, act to maximize their psychic rather than monetary profit, and that such psychic profit may include all sorts of values, none of which is more or less arbitrary than another. Furthermore, Hayek here seems to be implying that employees have some sort of right to continuing employment. A right is an overt contradiction to the property rights of employers to their own money. Hayek concedes that dismissal is ordinarily not coercive. Why then, in conditions of acute unemployment, surely in any case not of the employer's making, or of the mining town? Again, miners have moved voluntarily to the mining town, if they like. Hayek commits a similar error when he deals with the refusal to exchange made by a monopolist, single owner of a resource. He admits that if I would very much like to be painted by a famous artist, and if he refused to paint me for less than a very high fee or at all, it would clearly be absurd to say that I am coerced. Yet he does apply the concept of coercion to a case where a monopolist owns water in an oasis. Suppose, he says, that people had settled there on the assumption that water would always be available at a reasonable price, that then other water sources had dried up, and that people then had no choice but to do whatever the owner of the spring demanded of them if they were to survive. Here would be a clear case of coercion, since the good or service in question is crucial to their existence. Yet, since the owner of the spring did not aggressively poison the competing springs, the owner is scarcely being coercive. In fact, he is supplying a vital service and should have the right either to refuse a sale or to change whatever the customers will pay. Charge whatever the situation may well be unfortunate for the customers, as are many situations in life. But the supplier of a particularly scarce and vital service is hardly being coercive by either refusing to sell or by setting a price that the buyers are willing to pay. Both actions are within his rights as a free man and as a just property owner. The owner of the oasis is responsible only for the existence of his own actions and his own property. He is not accountable for the existence of the desert or for the fact that the other springs have dried up. Ooh. Furthermore, as Professor Ronald Hamowy points out in a brilliant critique of Hayek's concept of coercion and of law, we are faced with what appears to be an insurmountable problem. What constitutes a reasonable price? By reasonable, Hayek might mean competitive, but how is it possible to competitive price is absence of competition? Economics cannot predict the cardinal magnitude of any market price in the absence of a market. What then can we assume to be a reasonable price? Or more to the point, at what price does the contract alter its nature, become an instant coercion? Is it at 1 cent a gallon, at $1 a gallon, at $10 a gallon? What if the owner of the spring demands nothing more than the friendship of the settlers? Is such a price coercive? By what principle can we decide when the agreement is a simple contractual one? Moreover, Hamowy states, we must face yet a further difficulty. Is the owner acting coercively if he refuses to sell his water at any price? Suppose that he looks upon his spring as sacred and its water as holy. To offer the water to the settlers would contravene his deepest religion. Here is a situation which would not fall under Hayek's definition of coercion. The owner of the spring forces no action. Yet it would appear that, within Hayek's own left open to the settlers, now is dying of thirst. Go back up. Let us postulate another situation. Suppose that there is only one physician in a community, and an epidemic breaks out. Only he can save the lives of numerous fellow citizens, an action surely crucial to their existence. Is he coercing them if he he refuses to do anything or leaves town, or B, he charges a very high price for his curative services? Certainly not. There is, for one thing, nothing wrong with a man charging the value of his services to his customers, i.e., what they are willing to pay. Further, has every right to refuse to do anything. While he may perhaps be criticized morally or aesthetically, as a self-owner of his own body, he has every right to refuse to cure or to do so at a high price. To say that he is being coercive is furthermore to imply that it is proper and not coercive to customers or their agents force the physician to treat them. In short, to justify his enslavement. But surely enslavement, compulsory labor, must be considered coercive in any sensible meaning of the term. All this highlights the gravely self-contradictory nature of including a forced activity or exchange in the same rubric of coercion with someone's peaceful refusal to make it. As I have written elsewhere, a well-known type of private coercion is the vague but ominous sounding economic power. Favorite illustration of the wielding of such power is the case of a worker fired from his job. Let us look at this situation closely. What exactly has he done? He has refused to continue to make a certain exchange the worker preferred to continue. Specifically, A, the employer refuses to sell a certain sum of money in exchange for the purchase of labor services. He would like to make a certain exchange, A would not. The same principle may apply to all the exchanges throughout the length and breadth of the economy. Economic power, then, is simply the right under freedom to choose to make an exchange. Every man has this power. Every man has the same right to make a preferred exchange. Now, it should become evident that the middle-of-the-road statist concedes the evil of violence, but adds that the violence of government is sometimes necessary to counteract the private coercion of economic power, caught in an impossible contradiction. A refuses to make an exchange with B. What are we to say, or what is the government to do, if B brandishes a gun and orders A to make the exchange? This is the crucial question. There are only two positions we may take on the matter. Either that B is committing violence and should be stopped at once, or that B is perfectly justified in taking this step because he is simply counteracting the subtle coercion of economic power wielded by A. Either the defense agency must rush to the defense of A, or it deliberately refuses, perhaps aiding B or doing B's work for him. There is no middle ground. B is committing violence. There is no question about that. In the terms of both doctrines, libertarian and the economic power argument, this violence is either invasive and therefore unjust, or defensive and therefore just. If we adopt the economic power argument, we must choose the latter position. If we reject it, we must adopt the former. If we choose the economic power concept, we must employ violence to combat any refusal of exchange. If we reject it, we employ violence to prevent any violent imposition of exchange. There is no way to escape this either-or choice. The middle-of-the-road statist cannot logically say that there are many forms of unjustified coercion. He must choose one or the other and take his stand accordingly. Either he must say that there is only one form of coercion, overt physical violence, or he must say there is only one form of coercion, refusal to exchange. And outlawing the refusal to work is, of course, a society of general slavery. Let us consider another example that Hayek quickly describes as non-coercive. A hostess will invite me to her parties only if I conform to certain standards of conduct and dress. This is certainly not coercion. Yet, as Professor Hamowy has shown, this case may well be considered coercion on Hayek's own criteria. Or, it might be that I am a very socially conscious person, and that my not attending this party would greatly endanger myself. Further, my dinner jacket is at the cleaners and will not be ready for a week, yet the party is tomorrow. Under these conditions, could it be said that my host's action demanding my wearing formal attire as the price of access to his home is in fact a coercive one, inasmuch as it clearly threatens the preservation of one of the things I most value, my social prestige. Furthermore, Emily points out that if the host should demand as a price of invitation to the party that I wash all the silver and china used at the party, Hayek would even more clearly have to call such a voluntary contract coercive on his own criteria. Attempting to rebut Hamowy's trenchant critique, Hayek later added that, to constitute coercion, it is also necessary that the action of the coercer should put the coerced in a regards as worse than that in which he would have been without that action. But, as Hamowy points out in reply, this does not salvage Hayek's insistent refusal to adopt patent absurdity of calling a condition of a party coercive, or the case just described seems to meet this condition well. This is so dry. Thanks for the input. So we should be looking at multi-chat. Sorry, I haven't been... okay, kick chat's full of bots. How's it going, Oiramui? Oiramui? I'm not sure which A it's supposed to be. Ram. Part of my brain saying read it like a Japanese word, but then the capital M. Yeah. Oiramui? It's shaped like a Japanese word. Almost. Actually, you can't have a double... Well, yes, you can. My brain slipped up there. It is so dry. We're talking about Hayek. And, the concept of coercion. We are most of the way through this very long book about political ethics. Yeah, bad ethics. I'm going to get back to reading. The case just described seems to meet this condition. While it is true that, in a sense, my would-be host has widened my... I have it as a PDF. You could probably find it as an EPUB without too much hassle. I'm reading a PDF. It's all the same to me. My would-be host has widened my range of alternatives by the invitation. The whole situation must include my inability to wear formal attire, and my consequent frustration is worse from my point of view. The situation which had obtained before the invitation, certainly worse than had existed, or my would-be host had decided to have a party at the time. Thus, Hayek and the rest of us are duty-bound to do one of two things: either to confine the concept of coercion strictly to the invasion of another person or property by the use or threat of physical violence, or to scrap the term coercion altogether and simply define freedom not as the absence of coercion, but as the absence of aggressive physical violence or threat thereof. Hayek indeed concedes that coercion can be so defined as to make it an all-pervasive and unavoidable phenomenon. Unfortunately, his middle-of-the-road failure to define coercion strictly to violence pervasively by a system of physical force cannot salvage that system by attempting to merely quantitatively between mild and more severe forms. Another fundamental fallacy of Hayek's system is not only his defining coercion beyond the sphere of physical violence, but also in failing to distinguish between aggressive and defensive coercion or violence. There is all the world of distinction in kind between aggressive violence, assault or theft against another, and violence to defend oneself and one's property against such aggression. Aggressive violence is criminal and unjust. Defensive violence is perfectly just and proper. The former invades the rights of person and property, the latter defends against such invasion. Yet Hayek again fails to make this crucial qualitative distinction. For him, there are only relative degrees or quantities. Thus, Hayek states that coercion, however, cannot be altogether avoided because the only way to prevent it is by the threat of coercion. From this, he goes on to compound the error by adding that free society has met this problem by conferring the monopoly of coercion on the state by attempting to limit this power of the state where it is required to prevent coercion by private persons. Can't read this stuff. Can't read stuff like this without Zotero. I need to annotate it. What is Zotero? Zotero. I don't feel the need to annotate this stuff, but ooh. Annotation tool. Huh. Neat. I'll think about looking into that. This seems straightforward to me. I'm wired this way. Where was I? I was there at the script 15. I also want to zoom in slightly more so it's bigger. I hurt my eyes less. I was going to ask questions like, what is defensive coercion? Yeah. So, the coercion stuff, it makes sense if you've read the previous chapters, so I'm gonna open up another copy of this. So we've just had the natural law section, and then, laying out a framework for when the legitimate uses of violence are. And, we're all the way down in, critiques of other theories. And so the defensive coercion is adapting this stuff into the framework of, talking about it as coercion, because that's how Hayek talks about it. Because, what Hayek... defensive coercion is, for example, if you try and attack me, I'm gonna, fight you back. That's what it is. So there's... Which is, distinction from, like, if you don't give me your stuff, I'm gonna attack you. That's, aggressive coercion. But if it's... It's physical aggression or the threat of physical aggression. Because, threats are still ethically substantial. But, we've just had the argument for it doesn't make sense to include the... It doesn't make sense to include non-physical forms of coercion under the ethical consideration you know, the sort of, if someone says, hey, if you don't give me money, I won't be your friend, you're not right in attacking them, for example. You know, don't be their friend, but, you know, they're not coercing you in the, you know, in the sense that it ought to be understood for the ethical framework. Where was I? Yet we are not here comparing varying degrees of an undifferentiated lump weak coercion, even if we define this as physical violence. For we can avoid aggressive violence completely by preventing it through purchasing services of defense agencies which are empowered to use only defensive violence. I think defensive means if you blackmail me. Blackmail is not exactly coercion. There's a chapter on blackmail in here. Right? It was bribery. I think the bribery one contains the blackmail stuff. But it might have been in the boycott. Because boycotts and blackmail are kinda similar. Not in the sense that not in the sense that it's productive for the ethical discussion. Because a lot of it is about defining your terms, and the terms have been defined several sessions ago. Also not coercion. So the way that coercion is being defined in this context is that it is the threat or the threat of the use of force against someone's personal property, or the actual physical force against someone's personal property. And then there's, you know, two senses that can be, you know, you can do it aggressively. It would be a lot of work to add annotations, and I have one view. But, you know, maybe I can do that for the next thing I read. Maybe something less full on. Because this is, you know, it's a very long book. Anyway. We can avoid aggressive violence completely by preventing it through purchasing the services of defense agencies, which are empowered to use only defensive violence. We are not helpless in the throes of coercion if we define such coercion only as aggressive violence. Or alternatively, we could abandon the term coercion altogether and keep the distinction between aggressive and defensive violence. Hayek's crucial second sentence in the above paragraph. Go back up and reference the above paragraph, which is going to be a while back. Compounds his error many times further. What was the... Okay, now I gotta go back up. This was Hammerwee's one. I don't know. It's gonna take me a bit of time to find. I'm not gonna reference. I'm just gonna try and figure it out from the. In the first place, in any and all historical cases, free society did not confer any monopoly of coercion on the state. Oh, it's that one. Yeah, genre. I wonder if there are any... okay. What about the Narnia guy, C.S. Lewis? Isn't he an academic? Isn't he a scholar, or is he just... Because he does scholarly work. You know, Mere Christianity and also... Relation of Man? Is that what it's called? A grief observed, problem of pain. Anyways, he's got a bunch of... So Lewis has a bunch of great academic stuff that would be quite good to read at some point. I haven't read Heinlein, so I don't have a good point of reference. There has never been any form of voluntary social contract. In all historical cases, the state has seized, by the use of aggressive violence and conquest, such a monopoly of violence in society. And further, what the state has is not so much a monopoly of coercion as of aggressive as well as defensive violence. And that monopoly is established and maintained by systematically employing two particular forms of violence: taxation for the acquisition of state income and the compulsory outlawry of competing agencies of defensive violence within the state's acquired territorial area. Therefore, since liberty requires the elimination of aggressive violence in society while maintaining defensive violence against possible invaders, the state is not and can never be justified as a defender of liberty. For the state lives, by its very existence, twofold and pervasive employment of aggressive violence against the very liberty and property of individuals that it is supposed to be defending. The state is qualitatively unjustified and unjustifiable. Thus, Hayek's justification of the existence of the state, as well as its employment of taxation and other measures of aggressive violence, rests upon his untenable obliteration of the distinction between aggressive and defensive violence, and his lumping of all violent action single rubric of varying degree of coercion. But this is not all, for in the course of working out his defense of the state and state action, Hayek not only widens the concept of coercion beyond physical violence, also unduly narrows the concept of coercion to exclude certain forms of aggressive physical violence in order to limit state coercion, i.e., to justify state action within such limits. Hayek asserts that coercion is either minimized or even does not exist if the violence-supported edicts are not personal and arbitrary, but are in the form of general universal rule, knowable to all in advance, the rule of law. Thus, Hayek states that the coercion which a government must still use is reduced to a minimum and made as innocuous as possible by restraining it through known general rule, so that in most instances, the individual need never be coerced unless he has placed himself in a position where he knows he will be coerced. Even where coercion is not avoidable, it is deprived of its most harmful effects by being confined to limited and foreseeable duty, or at least made independent of the arbitrary will of another person. Being made impersonal and dependent on general abstract rules, whose effect on particular individuals cannot be foreseen at the time they are laid down, even the coercive acts of government become data on which the individual can base his own plans. Hayek's avoidability criterion for allegedly non-coercive though violent action is put baldly as follows. Provided that I know beforehand that if I place myself in a particular position I shall be coerced. Defensive coercion is all measures used to demotivate a third party's it's hard to answer that question. Or it's hard to confirm or deny that, because we are sort of switching back between talking about how coercion should be defined, be a coherent thing, and how Hayek is using the term. But Hayek seems to use the term in the way you are describing. Well, he doesn't use the distinction defensive and aggressive coercion, though. He just, coercion. But it's useful for Rothbard to still delineate between those, even when switching back to Hayek's definition of coercion. But defensive coercion is coercion used to prevent coercion being coercive actions being taken against you. And it's quite hard to answer these questions because of a lot of context, and I'm not sure. I'm not inside of your brain, so I'm not sure what the right way to answer them would be. Anyway. Provided that I know beforehand that if I place myself in a particular position, I shall be coerced, and provided that I can avoid putting myself in such a position, I need never be coerced, at least insofar as the rules providing for coercion are not aimed at me personally, but are so framed as to apply equally to all people in similar circumstances. They are no different from any of the natural obstacles that affect my plan. But, as Professor Hammerwee trenchantly points out, it follows from this that if Mr. X warns me that he is going to kill me if I buy anything from Mr. Y, and if the products available from Mr. Y are also available elsewhere, probably from Mr. X, such action on the part of Mr. X is coercive. For purchasing from Mr. Y is avoidable, Hammerwee continues, avoidability of the action is sufficient according to this criterion to set up a situation theoretically identical to one in which a threat does not occur at all. The threatened party is no less free than he was before the threat was made if he can avoid the threatener's action. According to the logical structure of this argument, threatening coercion is not a coercive act. Thus, if I know in advance that I will be attacked by hoodlums if I enter a certain neighborhood, and if I can avoid that neighborhood, I need never be coerced by the hoodlums. Hence, one could regard the hoodlum-infested neighborhood in the same way as a plague-infested swamp, both avoidable obstacles neither personally aimed at me, and hence for Hayek not coercive. Yeah, there's a five-way conversation happening here, and at every point, or at almost every point, it's kind of one way, where Hammerwee is responding to Hayek, Hayek is quoting Hammerwee, I'm reading, and then you're typing in chat, Oi Ramui, which makes the communication quite difficult. But, not unwelcome. Well, if the hoodlum is intentionally ordered by a central command to attack strangers... Well, the... Katerina? I'll need to look up what it is, but... Well, the critique is that this thing is clearly coercive, but under the framework that Hayek has laid out, it would not be considered coercive. So, it's not a good framework for understanding or critiquing coercion. Because, avoidability doesn't seem sufficient. Thus, Hayek's avoidability criterion for non-coercion leads to a patently absurd weakening of the concept of coercion and the inclusion of aggressive and patently coercive actions for a benign, non-coercive rubric. And yet, Hayek is even willing to scuttle his own weak avoidability limit to government, for he concedes that taxation and conscription, for example, are not and are not supposed to be avoidable, but these too become non-coercive because they are at least predictable and enforced irrespective of how the individual would otherwise employ his energies. This deprives them largely of the evil nature of coercion. If the known necessity of paying a certain amount in taxes becomes the basis of all my plans, a period of military service is a foreseeable part of my career, then I can follow a general plan of life of my own making, and am as independent of the will of another person as men have learned to be in society. Oof. Is this Jesus responding to the thing Hayek is saying? Fair enough. Anyway, the absurdity of relying on general, universal, equally applicable, predictable rules as a criterion or as a defense for individual liberty has rarely been more starkly revealed. Rothbard's like a sweet old man, and he can't. Academics need to write in a way where they are pretending to be polite a lot of the time. It's especially clear if it's someone that they don't like, but I think they broadly, because Hayek is broadly libertarian adjacent. Like, he's not a libertarian, but like, Hayek seems to be someone that Rothbard actually kinda likes. And I get a sense with the next chapter, which is on Robert Nozick. I think that one's going to be snarky. Snarky and probably a lot of fun. What's the moth on my screen right now? Very distracting. Well, this means that, e.g., if there is a general governmental rule that every person shall be enslaved 1 year out of every 3, then such universal slavery is not at all coercive. In what sense, then, are Hayekian general rules superior or more libertarian than any conceivable case of rule by arbitrary whim? Let us postulate, for example, 2 possible societies. One is ruled by a vast network of Hayekian general rules, equally applicable, e.g., such rules as everyone is to be enslaved every 3rd year, no one may criticize the government under penalty of death, no one may drink alcoholic beverages, everyone must bow down to Mecca 3 times a day at specified hours, everyone must wear a specified green uniform, etc. It is clear that such a society, though meeting all the Hayekian criteria for a non-coercive rule of law, is thoroughly despotic and totalitarian. Let us postulate, in contrast, a second society which is totally free, where every person is free to employ his person and property, make exchanges, etc., as he sees fit, except that once a year the monarch, who does literally nothing else the rest of the year, commits one arbitrary invasive act against one individual that he selects. Which society is to be considered more free, more libertarian? Thus we see that Hayek's Constitution of Liberty can in no sense provide the criteria or the groundwork for a system of individual liberty. In addition to the deeply flawed definitions of coercion, a fundamental flaw in Hayek's theory of individual rights, as Hammaway points out, is that they do not stem from a moral theory or from some independent non-governmental social arrangement, but instead flow from government itself. For Hayek, government and its rule of law creates rights, rather than ratifies or defends them. It is no wonder that, in the course of his book, Hayek comes to endorse a long list of government actions clearly invasive of the rights and liberties of individual citizens. And Kick Chat's always bots all the time. No one on Kick wants to watch people read, like, academic stuff. Robert Nozick. I'm gonna take a quick breather before we get into this one, because I think it's slightly longer. Yeah, Kick isn't big enough, but it's also, like, a different audience. 31 to, like, 57. This is a 26 chapter one instead of a 12 chapter. So 26 page. This next one's gonna be twice as long. And probably, like, a lot meaner. I'm gonna be so close to the end. Part 5 doesn't look that long. That last sentence should be highlighted. Very chunky. It is no wonder that, in the course of his book, Hayek comes to endorse a long list of government actions clearly invasive of the rights and liberties of individual citizens. Yeah, I got good lungs, though. The getting Kick followers, but I'm not getting the Kick, the follower notification. It didn't pop up either of the times. Oh well. It was, someone selling stuff and a bot, I think, both times. So, Robert Nozick and the Immaculate Conception of the State. Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia is an invisible hand variant of the Lockean contractarian attempt to justify the state, or at least a minimal state, confined to the functions of protection. Beginning with a free market anarchist state of nature, Nozick portrays the state as emerging by an invisible hand process that violates no one's rights, first as a dominant protective agency, then to an ultra-minimal state, and finally to a minimal state. Yeah, rights are based on some outside philosophical backing. Because, yeah, so all the way for Hayek, so this was second to last chapter, sentence, why did I say chapter? For Hayek, government and its rule of law creates rights rather than ratifies or defends them. I think there was, when there's human rights as property rights, that was a good one, but where's, I'm thinking of a different book entirely, aren't I? Oh, no, there it is. Natural law versus positive law. I think it would be all in the natural law introduction. Yeah, Bill of Rights. Definitely places a heavy emphasis on the fact that I mean, it would have been very anachronistic for the Bill of Rights to have used other language than that. Because pre-democratic societies generally didn't consider rights to have come from the king, for example. They consider the king to be like a special kind of person with special rights, or with some authority to, in some instances, violate the rights of others, but you know, they wouldn't have considered him as being the figure from which people get their rights. Yeah, Conduit for God's Rule, that's roughly accurate. Someone appointed by God to an elevated position. The theology around that is also complicated, and I want to say out of scope, but I can't really be out of scope. It's my stream. Before embarking on a detailed critique of the various Nozikian stages, let us consider several grave fallacies of Nozick's conception itself, each of which would in itself be sufficient to refute his attempt to justify the state. First, despite Nozick's attempt to cover his tracks, it is highly relevant to see whether Nozick's ingenious logical construction has ever indeed occurred in historical reality, namely, whether any state, or most or all states, have in fact evolved in the Nozickian manner. It is a grave defect in itself when discussing an institution all too well grounded in historical reality that Nozick has failed to make a single mention or reference to the history of actual states. In fact, there is no evidence whatsoever that any state was founded or developed in the Nozickian manner. On the contrary, the historical evidence cuts precisely the other way. For every state where the facts are available, originated by a process of violence, conquest, and exploitation. In short, in a manner which Nozick himself would have to admit violated individual rights. Yeah, so I'm under I think it was Rothbard that has like a lot of beef with Nozick in an earlier chapter, but I'm not exactly. I might be thinking of introduction, preface. I don't know. I think it was Rothbard. It might have been Hopper, but probably not. I think Hopper had other beef with other people. Anyway, as Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense on the Origin of Kings and of the State, could we take off the dark covering of antiquity and trace them to their first rise, we should find the first of them nothing better than the principal ruffian of some restless gang, savage manners or preeminence in subtlety? Why does that not feel like the way the word should be spelled? Preeminence and subtlety obtained him the title of chief among plunderers, and who by increasing in power and extending his depredations overawed the quiet and defenseless to purchase their safety by frequent contributions. Note that the contract involved in Paine's account was of the nature of a coerced protection racket rather than anything recognizable to the libertarian as a voluntary agreement. Since Nozick's justification of existing states, provided they are or become minimal, rests on their alleged immaculate conception, and since no such state exists, then none of them can be justified, even if they should later become minimal. To go further, we can say that, at best, Nozick's model can only justify a state which indeed did develop by his invisible hand method. Therefore, it is incumbent upon Nozick to join anarchists calling for the abolition of all existing states, and then to sit back and wait for his alleged invisible hand to operate. The only minimal state, then, which Nozick at best can identify is one that will develop out of a future anarcho-capitalist society. Secondly, even if an existing state had been immaculately conceived, this would still not justify its present existence. A basic fallacy is endemic to all social contract theories of the state, namely that any contract based on a promise is binding and enforceable. If then everyone, in itself of course a heroic assumption, in a state of nature surrendered all or some of his rights to a state, the social contract theory considered this promise to be binding forevermore. A correct theory of contracts, however, termed by Williamson Evers the title transfer theory, states that the only valid and therefore binding contract is one that surrenders what is, in fact, philosophically alienable, and that only specific titles to property are so alienable, so that their ownership can be ceded to someone else. It flows through my head like milk because I read the earlier chapter on property rights and the theory of contracts. But yeah, it is a pretty chunky paragraph. So I know what he's talking about here with the title transfer theory, because I read about that actually weeks ago at this point, because I'm bad at streaming and I only read these on Sundays. While, on the contrary, other attributes of man, specifically his self-ownership over his own will and body, and the rights to person and property, which stem from that self-ownership, are inalienable, and therefore cannot be surrendered in a binding contract. If no one then can surrender his own will, his body, or his rights in an enforceable contract, a fortiori he cannot surrender the persons or the rights of his posterity. Chunky, yeah. This is what the Founding Fathers meant by the concept of rights as being inalienable, or as George Mason expressed it, his Virginia Declaration of Rights: all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent natural rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. Thus, we have seen 1. That no existing state has been immaculately conceived, quite the contrary. 2. That therefore the only minimal state that could possibly be justified is one that would emerge after a free market anarchist world has been established. 3. That therefore Nozick on his own grounds should become an anarchist and then wait for the Nozickian invisible hand to operate afterward. And finally, 4. That even if any state had been founded immaculately, the fallacies of social contract theory would mean that no present state, even a minimal one, could be justified. That's so much being said here. It's, full on the attack. Pressing the advantage, as you would. Let us now proceed to examine the Nozickian stages, particularly the alleged necessity, as well as the morality of the ways in which the various stages develop out of the preceding ones. Nozick begins by assuming that each anarchist protective agency acts morally and non-aggressively, that is, attempts in good faith to act within the limits of Locke's law of nature. First, Nozick assumes that each protective agency would require that each of its clients renounce the right of private retaliation against aggression by refusing to protect them against counter-retaliation. Perhaps not. This would be up to the various protection agencies acting on the market, and is certainly not self-evident. It is certainly possible, if not probable, that they would be outcompeted by other agencies that do not restrict their clients in that way. Nozick then proceeds to discuss disputes between clients of different protection agencies, offers 3 scenarios on how they might proceed. But 2 of these scenarios, and part of the 3rd, involve physical battles with agencies. In the first place, these scenarios contradict Nozick's own assumption of good faith, non-aggressive behavior by each of his agencies, since in any combat, clearly at least one of the agencies would be committing aggression. Furthermore, economically, it would be absurd to expect the protective agencies to battle each other physically. Such warfare would alienate clients and be highly expensive to. It is absurd to think that, on the market, protective agencies would fail to agree in advance on private appeals courts or arbitrators whom they would turn to resolve any dispute. Indeed, a vital part of the protective or judicial service a private agency or court would offer to its clients would be that it had agreements to turn disputes over to a certain appeals court or a certain arbitrator or group of arbitrators. The legal theory stuff is always exhausting. But it's always very, like, it's talking in the abstract about, like, an actual thing. So there's, like, you know, there's the nebulous part. You know, group of arbitrators, what does that look like? I need to come up with, you know, a sort of a shape in my head for that, because I know that this group of arbitrators is still a thing. I can't, my brain's not willing to let that be fully abstract in the same way that I can let, the, you know, inalienability be fully abstract. Or, I'm trying to think of other examples. Let us turn then to Nozick's crucial scenario 3, which he writes, the 2 agencies agree to resolve peacefully those cases about which they reach differing judgments. They agree to set up and abide by the decisions of some 3rd judge or court, which they can turn when their respective judgments differ, or they might establish rules determining which agency had jurisdiction under which circumstance. So far, so good, but then there comes a giant leap. Thus emerges a system of appeals courts and agreed upon rules. Though different agencies operate, there is one unified federal judicial system of which they are all components. I submit that the thus is totally illegitimate and that the rest is a non sequitur. The fact that every protective agency will have agreements with every other to submit disputes to particular appeals arbitrators does not imply one unified federal judicial system. On the contrary, there may well be, and probably would be, hundreds, even thousands of arbitrators or appeals judges would be selected, and there is no need to consider them part of one judicial system. There is no need, for example, to envision or to establish one unified Supreme Court to decide upon disputes, since every dispute has 2 and only 2 parties. There need be only one third party, judge, or arbitrator. There are, in the United States at the present time, for example, over 23,000 professional arbitrators and presumably there would be many thousands more if the present government court system were to be abolished. Each one of those arbitrators could serve an appeals or arbitration function. Yeah, this... I quite like this part of the theory. I know I say this stuff is kind of more exhausting to read than the more abstract philosophical stuff because I have to put a shape to it, but that does make it more fun. That does make it more fun because, you know, I could think, okay, well, what are these people like? Because arbitrators are still like characters. It's a guy. Or a girl, in some cases. And, you know, people agree on arbitrators before they go into agreements. Hopefully. Makes things a lot easier if you have a contract with an agreed upon third-party enforcement agent. Nozick claims that out of anarchy there would inevitably emerge, as by an invisible hand, one dominant protection agency in each territorial area, in which almost all the persons, funny quote there, yeah, in that area are included, though we have seen that his major support for that conclusion is totally invalid. Nozick's other arguments for this position are equally invalid. He writes, for example, that unlike other goods that are comparatively evaluated, maximal competing protective services cannot exist. Why cannot? Surely a strong term. First, because the nature of the service brings different agencies into violent conflict with each other, rather than just competing for customers. But we have seen that this conflict assumption is correct. First, on Nozick's own grounds of each agency acting non-aggressively, and second, on his own scenario 3, that each will enter into agreements with the others for peaceful settlement of disputes. Nozick's second argument for this contention is that, since the worth of the less than maximal product declines disproportionately with the number who purchase the maximal product, customers will not stably settle for the lesser good, and competing companies are caught in a declining spiral. But why? Nozick is here making statements about the economics of a protection market which are totally unsupported. Why is there such an economy of scale in the protection business that Nozick feels will lead inevitably to a near-natural monopoly in each geographical area? This is scarcely self-evident. On the contrary, all the facts, and here the empirical facts of contemporary and past history are again directly relevant, cut precisely the other way. There are, as was mentioned above, tens of thousands of professional arbitrators in the US. There are also tens of thousands of lawyers and judges. Hey, Demaniac, I don't believe you, buddy. Get out of here. I'm not gonna ban you because that takes effort, but like... Man, kick, am I right? There are also tens of thousands of lawyers and judges and a large number of private protection agencies that supply night watchmen, guards, etc., with no sign whatsoever of a geographical natural monopoly in any of these fields. Why then for protection agencies under anarchism? And if we look at approximations to anarchist court and protective systems in history, we again see a great deal of evidence of the falsity of Nozick's contention. For hundreds of years, the fairs of Champagne were the major international trade market in a number of courts by merchants, nobles, the church, etc., competed for customers. Not only did no one dominant agency ever emerge, but they did not even feel the need for appeals court. Huh. Yeah, international trade market. Europe. For 1,000 years, ancient island again, let's go. I need to read up on this. The ancient island stuff seems like a lot of fun. Hard to organize stuff? I'm not sure, wait. What's because it's hard to organize this stuff? For 1,000 years, ancient Ireland until the Cromwellian conquest. Decentralized markets arose. Centralized markets arose. It's hard to organize this stuff. I'm not sure what the input there is. Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think computing power alone is a solution. There's the but I don't think more computing power is the answer to the problem of economic calculation. I think markets only function because of their decentralized nature. I don't think there is a technological solution to economic calculation because of the nature of value. But it is also, like, a big discussion to get into. I think there is a sense in which we can use technology to solve economic problems, given like I could use technology to maximize the use of my stuff towards some given end because I know what I value and I can I can attribute resources to a bit of technology. But I think once you get a whole lot of people in there, because people value different things in different amounts, yeah, it's complicated. For 1,000 years, ancient Ireland, until the Cromwellian conquest, enjoyed a system of numerous jurists and schools of jurists, and numerous protection agencies, which competed within geographical areas without any one becoming dominant. After the fall of Rome, various coexisting barbarian tribes peacefully adjudicated their disputes within each area, with each tribesman coming under his own law, and with agreed upon peaceful adjudications between these courts and laws. Furthermore, in these days of modern technology and low-cost transportation and communication, it would be even easier to compete across geographical boundaries. The metropolitan, equitable, prudential protection agencies, for example, could easily maintain branch offices over a large geographical area. In fact, there is a far better case for insurance, natural monopoly, than protection. A larger insurance pool would tend to reduce premiums, and yet it is clear that there is a great deal of competition between insurance companies, and there would be more if it were not restricted by state regulation. Anyway, yeah, economic calculation is one of those things where I should read some papers that that believe in solutions to it. I do have an understanding of the peaceful between tribes. Again, like the absence of a note of a superscript number there makes it hard to tell how much rhetorical danger he's in. But I think if he is in error at this point, it's unforced. As in, you know, some of these examples being wrong in a technical sense wouldn't mean that his point is wrong. Just because, you know, it's... because the nature of the precise examples isn't a defense of those examples, but rather how these examples contradict Nozick's point. The Nozick contention that a dominant agency would develop in a geographical area, then, an example of an illegitimate a priori attempt to decide what the market would do. It is an attempt that flies in the face of concrete historical. Certainly, a dominant protective agency could conceivably emerge in a particular geographical area, but it is not very likely. And, as Roy Childs points out in his critique of Nozick, even if it did, it would not likely be a unified federal system. Childs also correctly points out that it is no more legitimate to lump all protective services together and call it a unified monopoly than it would be to lump all food growers and producers on the market together and say that they have a collective system or monopoly of food production. Furthermore, law and the state are both conceptually and historically separable, and law would develop in an anarchistic market society without any form of state, specifically concrete form of anarchist legal institution. Is this the dominant agency won't emerge? Well, he said that he's granted the possibility of a dominant protective agency. I'm not sure I see. But he just said a dominant protective agency could conceivably emerge. So his position isn't strictly that it won't emerge. Just that we don't have evidence to suggest that it's some inevitable outcome of the market, as Nozick has suggested. But rather, a kind of unlikely possibility. Yeah, it's not likely to emerge, economic forces, but the market is always free to act in a way that isn't expected, because people are weird. Like, you could conceivably have, if everyone in a country is Catholic, and the Catholics say, hey, use this agency. Is he saying that markets aren't self-optimized? I'm not sure that... I don't think that follows. I don't see how that would follow. Dominant agencies aren't necessarily optimal. Um, because agencies are in competition with each other, and so part of that competition is that they compete. But I think he means dominant in like not in the way that like McDonald's is a dominant fast food chain, but like in the sense that trying to think of like a not quite monopoly, but very near monopoly. Because he doesn't believe in natural monopolies, of course, because dominant agencies arise from a need. They fail to be optimal. I think it's very likely that the sort of optimizations you get from scale, I guess it could likely happen with agreements between agencies to cooperate in certain regards. But I don't know. I don't think the absence of a dominant agency is evidence that of suboptimality, especially when people like having a variety. You know, like the existence of competition is, in a sense, optimal. It's not strictly the one axis of financial optimality, though. Furthermore, law and the state are both conceptually and historically separable. I have read this before, but I should read. And law would develop in an anarchistic market society without any form of state, specifically the concrete form of anarchist legal institutes, judges, arbitrators, procedural methods for resolving disputes, etc., would indeed grow by a market invisible hand process, while the basic law code requiring that no one invade anyone else's person and property would have to be agreed upon by all the judicial agencies, just as all the competing judges once agreed to apply and extend the basic principles of the customary or common law. But the latter, again, would imply no unified legal system of dominant protective agency. Any agency that transgressed the basic libertarian code would be open outlaws and aggressors, and Nozick himself considered that, lacking legitimacy, such outlaw agencies would probably not do very well in an anarchist society. Let us now assume that a dominant protective agency has come into being, as unlikely as that may be. How then do we proceed? Without violation of anyone's property right. To Nozick's ultra-minimal state, Nozick writes of the plight of the dominant protective agency, which sees the independents with their unreliable procedures rashly and unreliably retaliating against. Should the dominant agency have the right to defend its clients against these rash actions? Nozick claims that the dominant agency has a right to prohibit risky procedures against its clients, and that this prohibition thereby establishes a minimal state, in which one agency coercively prohibits all other agencies from enforcing the rights of individuals. I'm gonna go over that again, but he's independent. Huh. So it's the premise that the state, or the ultra minimal state, has a right to protect its clients from other protection agencies that would be its competition. Fascinating. There are two problems here at the very beginning. In the first place, what has happened to the peaceful resolution of disputes that marked Scenario 3? Why can't the dominant agency and the independents agree to arbitrate or adjudicate their disputes, preferably in advance? But here we encountered Nozick's curious thus clause, incorporated such voluntary agreements into one unified federal judicial system. In short, if every time that the dominant agency and the independents work out their disputes in advance, Nozick then calls this one agency, then by definition he precludes the peaceful settlement of disputes without a move onward, the compulsory monopoly of the minimal state. But suppose, for the sake of continuing the argument, that we grant Nozick his question-begging definition of one agency. Would the dominant agency still be justified in outlawing competitors? Certainly not, even if it wishes to preclude fighting. For what of the many cases in which independents are enforcing justice for their own clients and have nothing to do with the clients of the dominant agency? By what conceivable right does the dominant agency step in to outlaw peaceful arbitration and adjudication between the independent's own clients with no impact on its clients? If fighting lasts over 100 years, what? I don't understand the question. The answer is no right whatsoever, so that the dominant agency outlawing competitors is aggressing against their rights and against the rights of their actual or potential customers. Furthermore, as Roy Childs emphasizes, this decision to enforce their monopoly is scarcely the action of an invisible hand. It is a conscious, highly visible decision and must be treated accordingly. That justification for the dominant agency to impose violence on the independents. But if the independents aren't fighting, if they've got, the dominant agencies in an area, there's some people in the area that have that are going to the independent agency for enforcement of stuff. There's no fighting necessarily involved. Or if the dominant agent, if the independent agency is defending the if the independent agency is defending its independent clients from aggression by people that aren't being protected by the dominant agency. I mean, sure, some fighting may happen, but it's but it's defensive. It doesn't need to be warfare. It can just be like ordinary amounts of violence. When like SWAT shows up, that isn't warfare. Because, well, the independent agencies only have the right to aggress against the people who are, they only have the right to aggress on behalf of their clients against people who are unjustly aggressing against them. Under the libertarian framework, which Nozick is already presuming. I mean, libertarians don't believe in a world where no one ever fights. But I think, that would be an insane thing to think of anyone's ideology. Anyway, the dominant agency knows it claims has the right to bar risky activities engaged in by independents. But what then of the independents? Do not they have the right to bar the risky activities of the dominant? And must not a war of all against all again ensue, in violation of Scenario 3, and also necessarily engaging in some aggression against rights along the way? Where then are the moral activities of the state of nature assumed by Nozick all along? Furthermore, as Childs points out, what about the risk involved in having a compulsory monopoly protection agency? As Childs writes, what is to check its power? What happens in the event of its assuming even more powers? Since it has a monopoly, any disputes over its functions are solved and judged exclusively by itself. Careful prosecution procedures are costly. There is every reason to assume that it will become less careful without competition, and again, only it can judge the legitimacy of its own procedures, as Nozick explicitly tells us. Competing agencies, whether the competition be real or potential, not only ensure high-quality protection at the lowest cost, as compared to a compulsory monopoly, they also provide the genuine checks and balances of the market against any one agency yielding to the temptations of being an outlaw. I mean, yeah, in a sense, yeah, the checks and balances are in a sense rebellion of the populace, although in this case the rebellion is, in this case the populace is going to be some protection agency independently appointed by the populace against the compulsory monopoly, or I guess non-compulsory monopoly. That's what we're talking about. So yeah, rebellion, in a sense, good. Problem with rebellions is that they tend to not be ordered towards the production of libertarianism, but rather in, the replacement of the state with a new state. And it's hard to not do that. So any one agency yielding to the temptations of being an outlaw, that is, of aggressing against the persons and property of its clients or non-clients. If one agency among many becomes outlaw, there are others around to do battle against it on behalf of the rights of their clients. But who is there to protect anyone against the state? Whether ultra-minimal or minimal, if we may be permitted to return once more to the historical record, the grisly annals of crimes and murders of the state throughout history give one very little confidence in the non-risky nature of its activity. I submit that the risks of state tyranny are far greater than the risks of worrying about one or two unreliable procedures of competing defense agencies. But this is scarcely all, for once it is permitted to proceed beyond defense against an overt act of actual aggression, once one can use force against someone because of his risky activities, the sky is then the limit. I think academics can be excused for repeating words. But yeah, maybe it's sloppy. This is a very long book. I repeat words often. Sky's the limit, and there is virtually no limit to aggression against the rights of others. Once permit someone's fear of the risky activities of others to lead to coercive action, then any tyranny becomes justified, and Nozick's minimal state quickly becomes the maximal. I maintain, in fact, that there is no Nozickian stopping point from his ultra-minimal state to the maximal totalitarian state. There is no stopping point to so-called preventative restraint or detention. Surely Nozick's rather grotesque suggestion of compensation in the resort detention centers is scarcely sufficient to ward off the specter of totalitarianism. A few examples. Perhaps the largest criminal class today in the United States is teenage black males. Careful, Rothbard. The risk of this class committing crime is far greater than any other age, gender, or color group. Why not, then, lock up all teenage black males until they are old enough for the risk to diminish? And then I suppose we could compensate them by giving them healthful clothing, playgrounds, and teaching them a useful trade in the resort detention camp. If not, why not? Example, the most important argument for prohibition was the undoubted fact. That is a hilarious example. It's a reductio ad absurdum. But he chose like a really off-color reductio ad absurdum. Because Nozick's saying this protection agency is justified in reacting to the riskiness of competing protection agencies. And, you know, it doesn't make much sense to be able to respond to the riskiness of some agent without, you know, expanding that in some sense. And we have observable risk. The point is that it would be really bad to arrest all the young black men just for being young black men. It would also like greatly increase the risk from young black men because of course they're going to retaliate. I don't know much about El Salvador. Did this happen in El Salvador? I'm not like American. Reduce crime by a ton. Okay, that's... Even if it reduced crime by a ton, every gang is different. I think people that are in gangs have communicated an intent, right? Like, I think there's two meanings we're taking of criminal class here. So this use of the term criminal class, Rothbard was meaning class of people, you know, by proportion of criminality. And what you're saying by criminal class, I think, is largest category of people who are all criminals. Because, like, it's probably generally true that every gang member is a criminal. That's what being in a gang is for. Class is always one of those nebulous words. I think he's using it in a way where he's expecting a charitable reading. I need to do the legwork there for it to make sense, but if he worded it in a way where I didn't need to do the legwork, it would be unwieldy. And the legwork doesn't take long for me to do. I've been hanging out with Rothbard for a while. Example, the most important argument for prohibition was the undoubted fact that people commit significantly more crimes, acts of negligence, on the highways when under the influence of alcohol than when cold sober. So why not prohibit alcohol and thereby reduce risk and fear, perhaps, compensating the unfortunate victims of the law by free tax-financed supplies of healthful grape juice, or the infamous Dr. Arnold Hutschinker's plan of identifying allegedly future criminals in the grade school, and then locking them away for suitable brainwashing. If not, why not? Kind of examples are fun because you get to say the worst things and you get to say, hey, this is your position. Sup, Raimundo? No, Rothbard is critiquing Nozick at this point. Quite funny. In each case, I submit that there is only one why not, and this should be no news to libertarians who presumably believe in inalienable individual rights, namely that no one has the right to coerce anyone not himself directly engaged in an overt act of aggression against rights. Any loosening of this criterion to included coercion against remote risks is to sanction impermissible aggression against the rights of others. Any loosening of this criterion, furthermore, is a passport to unlimited despotism. Any state founded on these principles has been conceived not immaculately, i.e. without interfering with anyone's rights, but by a savage act of rape. Very strong wording. Unnecessarily strong wording. Thus, even if risk were measurable, even if Nozick could provide us with a cutoff point of when activities are too risky, his rite of passage from dominant agency to ultra-minimal state would still be aggressive, invasive, and illegitimate. I don't think... It's not a leap, it's just... It's poetic. It's definitely... He's talking about, you know, the conception of... It is the end of the book. You do get to use whatever words you want. The review board didn't get this far. His rite of passage from dominant agency to ultra-minimal state would still be aggressive, invasive, and illegitimate. Furthermore, as Childs pointed out, there is no way to measure the probability of such risk, let alone the fear, both of which are purely subjective. The only risk that can be measured is found in those rare situations, such as lottery or a roulette wheel, where the individual events are random, strictly homogeneous, and repeated a very large number of times. In almost all cases of actual human action, these conditions do not apply, and so there is no measurable cutoff point of risk. I think Raimundo's missing the context, so it seems like a leap because he's missed the part where Rothbard's argued this. This brings us to Williamson Evers's extremely useful concept of the proper assumption of risk. Actually, it is quite frustrating when people on the internet, they post like the conclusion of an argument that someone's had. Well, there's conclusions in each chapter. So, actually, mostly these ones had, like, conclusions at the end. not really like a premise at the start, final thoughts at the end. It's more each. Yeah, okay. Each part's. I don't think we're halfway through. So it's 240 out of like 256. So we're not near the end of the chapter. Anyway, sometimes people post like the conclusion of an argument that some philosophers had, like on Facebook or something, and they're like, "Hey, here's this thing," and then of course people disagree because they don't have the argument, and because the person posting it isn't as smart as the person they're quoting, they flounder on it. And that's very frustrating to see, because often it's like, okay, I agree with the conclusion, but you haven't made a case for it. This does seem out of nowhere. The whole point of a part is to separate into 3 acts and then 3 acts again fractally. Maybe. Full narrative. I'll need to think on that one. We live in a world of ineluctable and unmeasurable varieties of uncertainty and risk. In a free society, possessing full individual rights, the proper assumption of risk is by each individual over his own person and his justly owned property. No one, then, can have the right to coerce anyone else into reducing his risks. Such coercive assumption is aggression and invasion to be properly stopped and punished by the legal system. Of course, in a free society, anyone may take steps to reduce risk that do not invade someone else's rights and property. For example, by taking out insurance, hedging operations, performance bonding, etc. But all of this is voluntary, and none involves either taxation or compulsory monopoly. And, as Rothschild states, any coercive intervention in the market's provision for risk shifts the societal provision for risk away from the optimal, and hence increases risk to society. One example, Rothschild is stating this, but maybe. I'll need to think on this one. It makes sense intuitively, but I'm not sure it makes sense logically. What if we had an incorruptible, centralized system that learns and builds upon itself? Is that possible? How can something be incorruptible, but also learn and build upon itself? AGI, I don't think AGI is incorruptible. Or at least, I think you need a solid definition of incorruptibility for you to convince me that that's possible. It would seem to me that the ability to learn and build upon itself would entail corruptibility, but also, if the thing is in an initially corrupt state, it doesn't matter if it's then incorruptible, because it is still corrupt. It just doesn't become corrupt. So, like, if you had, like, an immortal God Emperor fella, How does it learn then? Yeah, if you had an immortal god emperor, like I guess and he's like extraordinarily wise, but also wicked, and so he doesn't get persuaded. Corruption's not born, it's made. But yeah, I mean, just from the statistics, I don't think impartial statistical preferences like there's no impartial ordering of data. All ordering of data is necessarily influenced by the person submitting it. Or, I guess the system submitting. And then in that case it's influenced by the people who created the system that submits the data. I'm not a big believer in AGI anyway. I think AI will always be somewhat euphemistic. They'll never be intelligent in the way that people. Although I would not be happy to be proven wrong, because it is annoyingly ethically complicated. One example of Nozick's sanctioning aggression against property rights is his concern with the private landowner is surrounded by enemy landholders who won't let him. Oh, this one. I think about this one all the time. The point is that it isn't the type of intelligence we use. I know. I saw a thing the other day about water being intelligent and that it can solve mazes, and I think we should be fine with like people fulfilling these libertarian definitions, or at least, people in general holding other people to these definitions. We don't need like a funky little robot doing it. You know what? Your name has the word RAM in it. I'm starting to suspect you are an AGI, or something like an AGI, here to infiltrate normal human society and have us build like a more advanced version of you. Maybe you're like... Maybe you're the Silver Surfer to the Galactus that is Rocco's Basilisk. You're the harbinger of Rocco's Basilisk. You're here to make sure that we're all set to work building you. It would be mixing mathematics with natural and social sciences, and with other aspects such as a formalist monism like the Vienna Circle. Hold up, let me Google, like, formalist monism. I'm vaguely aware of monism as an idea. A theory of doctrine that denies the existence of a distinction or duality in a particular sphere, such as that between matter and mind, or between formal sciences and social sciences. Yeah, sure. Then I look up Vienna Circle. The inner circle, logical empiricism. I gotta switch to a different screen. This is way too small. Well, let me just... The Vienna Circle of logical empiricism was a group of elite philosophers and scientists drawn from natural and social sciences, logic, and mathematics. So, like... called. We have, like, you put the smart people in charge. The word for it, I always forget. Autocracy? Is that it? We want, like, AI autocrats? I don't think that's a good idea. But you can see that logical positivism is purplified. Yeah, I need to read more because I'm doing these streams to learn more things, but then I also attract people that may or may not be smarter than me. And that is complicated. Because I'm the one on stage, but then I've attracted an audience that seem fairly intelligent. Why the English Wikipedia calls them elite philosophers. Where does it say elite philosophers? Oh, a group of elite. I gotta think about what the word elite specifically entails. Because it doesn't mean like... It doesn't necessarily mean like the best of the best. It means elevated. So, bit of a truism in that they're, like, sure, they're necessarily elite philosophers because they're philosophers that have been elevated into the Vienna Circle. Presuming that the Vienna Circle is, maybe. I think you could view the word elite as being, being somewhat neutral. Like you can refer to sports teams as having elite athletes without necessarily being fans of those athletes. But it's a complicated word. And English isn't very good with honor-related concepts. Due to the history of liberalism in English-speaking countries. It's quite complicated. Anyway, so, the private landowner who is surrounded by enemy landholders won't let him leave. Which is a thing I think about a lot because, like, it is complicated. To the libertarian reply that any rational landowner would have first purchased access rights from surrounding landowners, Nozick brings up the problem of being surrounded by such a set of numerous enemies that he still would not be able to go anywhere. But the point is that this is not simply a problem of land ownership. Not only in the free society, but even now, suppose that one man is so hated by the whole world that no one will trade with him or allow him on their property. Well then, the only reply is that this is his own proper assumption of risk. Any attempt to break that voluntary boycott by physical coercion is illegitimate aggression against the boycotter's rights. This fellow had better find some friends, or at least purchase allies, as quickly as possible. That's rough. Yeah, hey, what if everyone hates you? I guess that's not a good situation in any ideology. Like, oh, what if you're in a socialist commune, but everyone hates you and doesn't want to give you access to anything? Yeah, but then yeah, it would. This is just sort of reassertion of libertarianism. How then does like libertarianism in principle? But yeah, you have some power over this as a market agent. USSR? Yeah, the USSR did. No one liked them by the end because. Whew. And then like all the vassal states turned against the USSR. What if you pursued scientific beliefs and it went against the agenda of the day? I'm not sure what the problem there would be. Like, there is a sense where, like, sure, if you live in a society where saying certain things will make everyone hate you and boycott you, sure, it's a problem, it's a trouble you gotta get through. But that's not, like, unique to libertarianism. And at least in the libertarian system, they're not justified in aggressing against person and property. But under the state, if you say things that the state deems worthy of punishing you for, the state is legitimated. Viktor Lysenko literally killed the father of genetic erosion because the ideas disagree with his theory that damaging crops on purpose would make them hardier permanently. Lysenkoism is a wild trip. I'm still unsure on how much is necessarily trustworthy from, like, the traditional narrative around it. But I'm willing to believe that Lysenko was properly an absolute madman, because we do have other historical cases of people with insane pseudoscientific beliefs causing a lot of trouble. Like, there's that one Chinese historical figure who tried to rocket himself to the moon with a bunch of fireworks, and that didn't work. For all the Chinese feudal lords that drank mercury to give them immortality. Just wacky, man. Anyway. Also, it's starting to rain. How then does Nozick proceed from his ultra-minimal to his minimal state? Ooh. We're moving on to the next. He maintains that the ultra-minimal state is morally bound to compensate the prohibited would-be purchasers of the services of independence by supplying them with protective services, and hence the night watchman or minimal state. This is the first time I've encountered the night watchman state. As a kid, as a wee lad, I was one of those night watchman state fellows. It was not particularly rigorous, but in my defense, it's still more rigorous than current democratic thought. In the first place, this decision too is a conscious and visible one, scarcely the process of an invisible hand. It's the situation where you have a state that exists, but its only role is enforcement of contracts and enforcement of a basic, like an incredibly basic law about protection. So, you know, it protects everyone under its jurisdiction from aggression, and it protects and it enforces contracts made between people under its jurisdiction, and then it collects enough in taxes. Libertarianism is anarchistic, so they don't have an ideal state. Like, libertarianism, properly understood, anarchistic, but, you know, it's sort of the idea you come up with if you're approaching libertarianism, but you can't conceive of another state, or you don't want to for some reason, which is a lot of people's tendency. I think there's a lot of common ground to be made with Night Watchman state people, minarchists, I mean, minarchist is a bit more complicated because it's a more umbrella term. It's like, okay, we may as well try for this because it's less bad than, you know, the sort of broad overreach of a modern state. In all the ways that are, like, you know, in a bunch of ways that are relevant. But then, you know, we're being critical of it here. But more importantly, Nozick's principle of compensation is in even worse philosophical shape, if that is possible, than his theory of risk. For first, compensation in the theory of punishment is simply a method of trying to recompense the victim of crime. It must in no sense be considered a moral sanction for crime itself. Nozick asks whether property rights means that people are permitted to perform evasive actions, provided that they compensate the person whose boundary has been crossed. In contrast to Nozick, the answer must be no in every case. As Randy Barnett states, critique of Nozick, contrary to Nozick's principle of compensation, all violations of rights should be prohibited. That's what right means. And, while voluntarily paying a purchase price makes an exchange permissible, compensation does not make an aggression permissible or justified. Rights must not be transgressed, period. Compensation being simply one method of restitution or punishment after the fact. I must not be permitted to cavalierly invade someone's home and break his furniture simply because I am prepared to compensate him afterward. Secondly, there is no way of knowing in any case what the compensation is supposed to be. Nozick's theory depends on people's utility scales being constant, measurable, and knowable to outside observers, none of which is the case. Austrian subjective value theory shows us that people's utility scales are always subject to change, and that they can neither be measured nor known to any outside observer. If I buy a newspaper for 15 cents, then all that we can say about my value scale is that at the moment of purchase, the newspaper is worth more to me than the 15 cents, and that is all. The evaluation can change tomorrow, and no other part of my utility scale is knowable to others at all. A minor point, Nozick's pretentious use of the difference curve concept is not even necessary for his case. It adds still further fallacies, for indifference is never by definition limited. in actual exchanges and is therefore unknowable and objectively. Moreover, an indifference curve postulates two commodity axes. And what are the axes of Nozik's alleged curve? But if there is no way of knowing what will make a person as well off as before any particular change, there is no way for an outside observer, such as the state, to discover how much compensation is needed. The Chicago School tries to resolve this problem by simply assuming a person's utility loss measured by the money price of the loss. Yeah, we're getting into economics and compensation. So in the Austrian model of economics, Austrian theory of value, which is the correct one, value is praxeological and praxeological, subjective, and ordinal. And it's actually quite difficult for economic calculation reasons. So Rothbard is challenging Nozick on the premise that there is an economic calculation issue with his theory of the state gets to do bad things because it compensates people for it later. So Nozick suggests that the state can do things that would normally be impermissible because it then goes back and it gives some form of compensation to the people that it wronged. Yeah, such as eminent domain. That's actually a pretty good example. So yeah, eminent domain. Although it's a bit different than eminent. Eminent domain is close enough at that. So there's an. Actually, let's say for eminent domain, and actually same for the compensation issue, we can actually tell that it's insufficient just from the fact that the person being aggressed against would not have accepted the compensation, and that's why the aggression is necessary. Although Rothbard might be getting to that. But you know, if I assault you with the knowledge that I am going to pay you an amount equivalent to compensate you for the amount of wrong I've done to you for assaulting you. It's not like a coherent. I can't like place a number on the amount of wrong that I've done in assaulting you because I don't know how greatly you would value not getting assaulted. I don't know like what number I would need to say. You know, how much would you let me pay you to assault you in this way? If that were a thing that I would have known, I could have just paid you the money beforehand and then assaulted you. But since I'm, you know, going on this compensation method, I have presumed an amount. The Chicago School. Yeah, I quite like the Chicago School peeps. They seem quite nice. I should read Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. Sowell? I always say it written, I never hear it said. Anyway. The Chicago School tries to resolve this problem by simply assuming that a person's utility loss is measured by the money price of the loss. So if someone slashes my painting, and outside appraisers determine that I could have sold it for $2,000, then that is my my proper compensation. But first, no one really knows what the market price would have been. Tomorrow's market may well differ from yesterday. And second and more important, my psychic attachment to the painting may be worth far more to me than the money price, and there is no way for anyone to determine what the psychic attachment might be worth. Asking is invalid since there is nothing to prevent me from lying grossly in order to drive up the compensation. Yeah, the use of the word psychic always makes me think, okay, there's something going wrong here, because I don't trust that word. You know, that always seems like woo, but they're just they're meaning the amount you value something in your psyche. Like, it is, you know, it's just in the brain. My brain goes, oh, psychic, like lifting things with your brain. Which reminds me of a quote I read today that I will try to recite from memory, which is, you know, I've heard it said that gravity is the weakest force, but it is strong enough to resist me trying to levitate objects with my mind. So truly, telekinesis must be the weakest. Writing about Andres Sanfuentes Vergara. He was part of the group of economists known as the Chicago Boys, and one of the authors of the founding document for the dictatorial economic model called the Brick. Ooh. The Chicago Boys is a very good name for a boy band. Although Andres Sanfuentes Vergara is going to have to go through like a rebranding. Because very Hispanic names don't play well with American audiences. They tend to be the main consumers of boy bands, as far as I'm aware. Moreover, Nozick says nothing about the dominant agency compensating its clients for the shutting down of their opportunities in being able to shift their purchases to competing agencies. The cumulative sum of the weakest force is enough to stop my levitation. True. Yeah. Something people ignore a lot with gravity is that it's a cumulative effect. Well, yeah, I mean, also, yeah, a pseudo-force. But is elasticity a pseudo-force? I'm fairly sure it might be. You know what? Is elasticity a pseudo-force? This is one of the ones we learned about in high school. Not a pseudo-force. Okay. I was thinking it is caused by something. Real contact force, not a pseudo-force. But rather apparent forces that result in... Okay, so it's only a pseudo-force if it's to do with non-inertial reference frames. That makes sense. So even though it is an effect of another force, it doesn't qualify as a pseudo-force just because of a pseudo-force. It doesn't need to be... Yeah, I guess, because, like, friction is a force, and not a pseudo-force. It makes sense. I'm not a physicist. I took enough physics to get me through high school, and I was very good at it, but I'm not a physicist. I do like arguing with people about the shape of the Earth, because of course I do. So there's nothing about the dominant agency compensating its clients for the shutting down of their opportunities in being able to shift their purchases to competing agencies. Yet their opportunities are shut off by compulsion, and furthermore, they may well perceive themselves as benefiting from the check on the possible tyrannical impulses of the dominant agency. But how is their horror at seeing the state emerge, and how much are they to be paid? In fact, the existence of only one fervent anarchist who could not be compensated for the psychic trauma inflicted on him by the emergence of the state is enough by itself to scuttle Nozick's allegedly non-invasive model, the origin of the state. Many libertarian Millet. Millet's an interesting character. I'm increasingly seeing Millet get called a Jewish puppet, and I'm not sure how accurate that accusation is. I think he's beholden to political ripstream. Maybe. You know, I see Millet get called a Jewish puppet, but it might be that he's just beholden to international foreign policy interests in the way that, like, any politician is. And it's complicated. I think being a libertarian politician puts you in a very difficult position where you have to balance the functionality of the system and its disagreement with your ethical system. Anyway, for that absolutist anarchist, no amount of compensation would suffice to assuage his grief. This brings us to another flaw in the Dickian scheme. The curious fact that the compensation paid by the dominant agency is paid not in cash, but in the extension of its sometimes dubious services to clients of other agencies. And yet, advocates of the compensation principle have demonstrated that cash, which leaves the recipients free to buy whatever they wish, is far better from their point of view than any compensation in kind. Yet, Nozick, in postulating the extension of protection as the form of compensation, never considers the cash payment alternative. In fact, for the anarchist, this form of compensation, institution of the state itself, is a grisly and ironic one indeed. As Childs forcefully points out, Nozick wishes to prohibit us from turning to any of a number of competing agencies, other than the dominant protection agency. What is he willing to offer us as compensation for being so prohibited? He is generous to a fault. He will give us nothing less than the state. Let me be the first to publicly reject this admittedly generous offer. But the point is, we can't reject it. It is foisted upon us whether we like it or not, whether we are willing to accept the state as compensation or not. Furthermore, there is no warrant whatever, even on Nozick's own terms, animal states compensating everyone uniformly. As he postulates, surely there is no likelihood of everyone's value scales being identical, but then how are the differences discovered and differential compensation paid? In confining ourselves to Nozick's compensated people, former or current would-be clients of competing agencies, who are they? How can they be found? Or, on Nozick's own terms, only such actual or would-be competing clients. But how does one distinguish, as proper compensation must, between those who have been deprived of their desired independent agency and who therefore deserve compensation, and those who wouldn't have patronized the independents anyway, i.e., who therefore don't need compensation. By not making such distinctions, Nozick's mental state doesn't even engage in proper compensation on Nozick's terms. Giles raises another excellent point on Nozick's own prescribed form of compensation. Dire consequences for the minimal state of the fact that the payment of such compensation necessarily raise the costs and therefore the prices charged by the dominant agency. As Shiles states, if the minimal state must protect everyone, even those who cannot pay, and if it must compensate those others for prohibiting their risky action, then this must mean that it will charge its original customers more than it would have in the case of the ultra-minimal state. But this would, ipso facto, increase the number of those who, because of their demand curve, would have chosen non-dominant agency over dominant agency, ultra-minimal state turned minimal state. Must the minimal state then protect them at no charge, or compensate them for prohibiting them from turning to the other agency? If so, then once again, it must either increase its price to its remaining customers, or decrease its services. In either case, this again produces those who, given the nature and shape of their demand curves, would have chosen the non-dominant agencies over the dominant agency. Must these then be compensated? If so, then the process leads on to the point where no one but a few wealthy fanatics advocating a minimal state would be willing to pay for greatly reduced services. If this happened, there is reason to believe that very soon the minimal state would be thrown into the invisible dustbin of history, which it would, I suggest, richly deserve. Fascinating. A tangential but important point on compensation. Adopting Locke's unfortunate proviso on homesteading property rights in unused land. Nozick declares that no one may appropriate unused land if the remaining population who desire to access land are worse off. But again, how do we know if they are worse off or not? In fact, Locke's proviso may lead to the outlawry of all private ownership of land. No one can always say that the reduction of available land leaves everyone else who could have appropriated the land worse off. In fact, there is no way of measuring or knowing when they are worse off or not. And even if they are, I submit that this too is their proper assumption of risk. Everyone should have the right to appropriate as his property previously unowned land or other resources. If latecomers are worse off, well then that is their proper assumption of risk in this free and uncertain world. There is no longer a vast frontier in the United States, and there is no point in crying over the fact. In fact, we generally achieve as much access as we want to these resources by paying a market price for them. But even if the owners refuse to sell or rent, got a highlightable page again. That should be their right in a free society. Even Locke could nod once. We come now to another crucial point that Nozick's presumption that he can outlaw risky activities upon compensation rests on his contention that no one has the right to engage in non-productive, including risky, activities or exchanges, and that therefore they can legitimately be prohibited. For Nozick concedes that if the risky activities of others were legitimate, then prohibition and compensation would not be valid, and that we would then be required instead to negotiate or contract with them, whereby they agree not to do the risky act in question. Why wouldn't we have to offer them an incentive, or hire them, or bribe them, refrain from doing the act? In short, If not for Nozick's fallacious theory of illegitimate, non-productive activities, he would have to concede people's rights to engage in such activities. Prohibition of risk and compensation principle fall to the ground, and neither Nozick's ultra-minimal nor his minimal state to be justified. And here we come to what we might call Nozick's drop-dead principle. Criterion of a productive exchange is one where each party is better off if the other did not exist at all. Whereas a non-productive exchange is one where one party would be better off if the other dropped it. Huh? Okay. Neither party... One where each party is better off if the other did not exist at all. Non-productive exchange is one where one party would be better off if the other dropped dead. Thus, if I pay you for not harming me, I gain nothing from you that I wouldn't possess if either you didn't exist at all or without anything to do with it. Nozick's principle of compensation maintains that a non-productive activity can be prohibited provided that the person is compensated by the benefit he was forced to forego from the imposition of the prohibition. These are chunky sentences. Let us then see how Nozick applies his non-productive and compensation criteria to the problem of blackmail. Nozick tries to rehabilitate the outlawry of blackmail by asserting that non-productive contracts should be illegal, and that a blackmail contract is non-productive because a blackmailee is worse off because the blackmailer's very existence. In short, if blackmailer Smith dropped dead, Jones, the blackmailee, would be better off. Or, to put it another way, Jones is paying not for Smith's making him better off, but for not making him worse off. But surely the latter is also a productive contract, because Jones is still better off making the exchange than he would have been if the exchange were not made. But this theory gets Nozick into very muddy waters indeed, some, though by no means all, of which he recognizes. He concedes, for example, that his reason for outlawing blackmail would force him also to outlaw the following contract. Brown comes to Green, next door neighbor. Following proposition: I intend to build such and such a pink building on my property. Knows that Green will protest. I won't build this building. However, if you pay me... I won't build this building, however, if you pay me X amount. Nozick concedes that this too have to be illegal in a schema, because Green would be paying Brown for not being worse off, and hence the contract would be non-productive. In essence, Green would be better off if Brown dropped dead. It is difficult, however, for a libertarian to square such outlawry with any plausible theory of property rights, much less the one set forth in the present volume. In analogy, blackmail example, furthermore, Nozick concedes that it would be legal in his schema for Green, on finding out about Brown's projected pink building, to come to Brown and offer to pay him not to go ahead. But why would such an offer be productive? Because Green made the offer? What difference does it make who makes the offer in the situation? Wouldn't Green still be better off if Brown dropped dead? And again, following the analogy, would Nozick make it illegal for Brown to refuse Green's offer and then ask for more money? Why, or again, would Nozick make it illegal for Brown to subtly let Green know about the projected pink building and then let nature take its course? Say, by advertising in the paper about the building and sending Green the clipping? Couldn't this be taken as an act of courtesy? And why should merely advertising something? Clearly, Nozick's case becomes even more flimsy as we consider the implications. Because of the implication. Furthermore, Nozick has not at all considered the manifold implications of drop-dead principle. If he is saying, as he seems to, that A is illegitimately coercing B if B is better off should A drop dead, then consider the following case. Brown and green are competing at auction. Same painting which they desire. They are the last two customers left. Wouldn't green be better off if brown dropped dead? Isn't brown therefore illegally coercing green in some way, and therefore shouldn't brown's participation be outlawed? Or, per contra, isn't green coercing brown in the same manner, and shouldn't green's participation in the auction be outlawed? If not, why not? Or, suppose that brown and green are competing for the hand of the same girl. Wouldn't each be better off if the other dropped dead? Or shouldn't either or both's participation in the courtship therefore be outlawed? Ramifications are virtually endless. Nozick, furthermore, gets himself into a deeper quagmire, and he adds that a blackmail exchange is not productive because outlawing the exchange makes one party, blackmailee, no worse off. But that, of course, is not true. As Professor Block has pointed out, outlawing a blackmail contract means that the blackmailer has no further incentive not to disseminate the unwelcome hitherto information about the blackmail party. However, after twice asserting that the victim would be no worse off, outlawing of the blackmail exchange, Nozick immediately and inconsistently concedes that people value a blackmailer's silence and pay for it. In that case, if the blackmailer is prohibited from charging for his silence, he need not maintain it, and hence the blackmailer payer would indeed be worse off because of the program. Nozick adds, without supporting the assertion, that his being silent is not a productive activity. Why not? Apparently because his victims would be as well off if the blackmailer did not exist at all. Back again to the drop-dead principle. But then, reversing his field once more, Nozick adds, inconsistently with his own assertion, that the blackmailer's silence is not productive. On the view we take here, a seller of such silence could legitimately charge only for what he forgoes by silence, including the payments others would make to him. Nozick adds that while a blackmailer may charge the amount of money he would have received for stealing the information, he may not charge the best price he could get from the purchaser of his silence. Thus, Nozick waffling on inconsistently between outlawing blackmailing and permitting only a price that the blackmailer could have received from selling the information, has mired himself into an unsupportable concept of a just price. Why is it only licit to charge the payment foregone? Why not charge whatever the blackmailee is willing to pay? In the first place, both transactions are voluntary and within the purview of both parties' property rights. Secondly, no one knows either conceptually or in practice what price the blackmailer could have gotten for his secret on the market. No one can predict a market price in advance of the actual exchange. Thirdly, the blackmailer may not only be gaining money from the exchange, also possibly gains psychic satisfaction. He may dislike the blackmailee, or he may enjoy selling secrets, and therefore he may earn from the sale to a third party more than just a monetary return. Here, in fact, Nozick gives away the case by conceding that the blackmailer who delights in selling secrets may charge differently. But in that case, what outside legal enforcement agency ever be able to discover to what extent the blackmailer delights in revealing secrets more than what price he may legally charge to the victim. More broadly, it is conceptually impossible ever to discover the extent of his subjective delight or of any other psychic factors that may enter into his value scale and therefore into his exchange. And fourthly, suppose that we take Nozick's worst case, a blackmailer who could not find any monetary price for his secret. But if blackmail were outlawed either totally or in Nozick's just price version, the reported blackmailer would simply disseminate the secrets would give away the information, blocks gossip or blabbermouth. Difficult words. In doing so, the blackmailer would simply be exercising his right to use his body, in this case his freedom of speech. There can be no just price restricting this right, but it has no objectively measurable value. Its value is subjective to the blackmailer, and his right may not be justly restricted. And furthermore, the protected victim is, in this case, surely worse off as a result of the prohibition against blackmail. Oh, we got like 4 more pages. Let's go. We're getting to the end of this eventually. We must conclude then with modern post-medieval economic theory. Only just price for any transaction, price voluntarily agreed upon by the two parties. Furthermore, and more broadly, we must also join modern economic theory in labeling all voluntary exchanges as productive, and as making both parties better off from making the exchange. Any good or service voluntarily purchased by a user or consumer benefits him and is therefore productive from his view. Hence, all of Nozick's attempts to justify either the outlawing of blackmail or the setting of some sort of just blackmail price, as well as for any other contracts that sell someone's inaction, fall completely to the ground. This means too that his attempt to justify the prohibition of any non-productive activities, including risk, fails as well, and hence fails on this ground alone. Nozick's attempt to justify his ultra-minimal as well as his minimal. In applying this theory to the risky, fear-inducing, non-productive activities of independent agency, which allegedly justify the imposition of the coercive monopoly of the ultra-minimal state, Nozick concentrates on his asserted procedural rights of each individual, which he states is the right to have his guilt determined by the least dangerous of the known procedures containing guilt, that is, by the one having the lowest probability of finding an innocent guilty party. Here, Nozick adds to the usual substantive natural rights the use of one's person and justly acquired property, unimpaired by violence, alleged procedural rights, or rights to certain procedures for determining innocence and guilt. But one vital distinction between a genuine and a spurious right is that the former requires no positive action by anyone except non-interference. Hence, a right to person and property is not dependent on time, space, or the number or wealth of other people in the society. So can have such a right against Friday as can anyone in an advanced industrial society. On the other hand, an asserted right to a living wage is a spurious one. Filling it requires positive action on the part of other people, as well as the existence of enough people with a high enough wealth or income to satisfy such a claim. Hence, such a right cannot be independent of time, place, or the number or condition of other persons in society. But surely a right to a less risky procedure requires positive action from enough people of specialized skills to fulfill such a claim. Hence, it is not a genuine right. Furthermore, such a right cannot be deduced from the basic right of self-ownership. On the contrary, everyone has the absolute right to defend his person and property against invasion. The criminal has no right, on the other hand, to defend his ill-gotten gains. But what procedure will be adopted by any group of people to defend their rights, whether, for example, personal self-defense or the use of courts or arbitration agents, depends on the knowledge and skill of the individuals concerned. Presumably, a free market will tend to lead to most people choosing to defend themselves with those private institutions and protection agencies. Procedures will attract the most agreement from people in society. In short, people who will be willing to abide by their decisions as the most practical way of approximating the determination of who, in particular cases, are innocent and who are guilty. But these are matters of utilitarian discovery on the market as to the most efficient means of arriving at self-defense, and do not imply any such fallacious concepts as procedural rights. Finally, in a scintillating tour de force, Roy Childs, after demonstrating that each of Nozick's stages to the state is accomplished by a visible decision rather than by an invisible hand, stands Nozick on his head by demonstrating that the invisible hand, on Nozick's own terms, would lead straight back from his minimal state to anarchism. Let's go, we love the invisible hand. Assume the existence of the minimal state. An agency arises which copies the procedures of the minimal state, allows the state to sit in on its trials, proceedings, and so forth. Under this situation, it cannot be alleged that this agency is any more risky than the state. If it is still too risky, then we are also justified in saying the state is too risky, and in prohibiting its activities, providing we compensate those who are disadvantaged by such prohibition. If we follow this course, the result is anarchy. If not, then the dominant agency turned minimal state finds itself competing against an admittedly watched over competing agency. But wait, being spied upon, pressed second agency finds that it can charge a lower price for its services. The minimal state has to compensate those who would have patronized agencies' risky procedures, pay the costs of spying on the new agency. Since it is only morally bound to provide such compensation, it is likely to cease doing so under severe economic pressure. This sets two processes in motion. Those formerly compensated because they would have chosen other agencies over the state rush to subscribe to the maverick agency, thus reasserting their old preferences. Also, another fateful step has been taken. The once proud minimal state, having ceased compensation, reverts to a lowly ultra-minimal state. But the process cannot be stopped. The maverick agency must and does establish a good record to win clients away from the ultra-minimal state. It offers a greater variety of services, toys with different prices, and generally becomes a more attractive alternative, all the time letting the state spy on it, checking its processes and procedures. Other noble entrepreneurs follow suit. Soon, the once lowly ultra-minimal state becomes a mere dominant agency, finding that the other agencies have established a noteworthy record with safe, non-risky procedures. Stop spying on them, preferring less expensive agreements instead. Its executives have, alas, grown fat and placid without competition. Their calculations of who to protect, how, by what allocation of resources, what ends, are adversely affected by their having formally removed themselves out of a truly competitive market price system. the dominant agency grows inefficient when compared to the new dynamic improved agencies. Soon, lo and behold, the mere dominant protection agency becomes simply one agency among many market legal network. The sinister minimal state is reduced by a series of morally permissible steps to violate the rights of no one to merely one agency among many. In short, the invisible hand strikes back. Some final, brief but important points. Nozick, in common with all other limited government laissez-faire theorists, has no theory of taxation, of how much it shall be, of who shall pay it, of what kind it should be, etc. Indeed, taxation is scarcely mentioned in Nozick's progression of stages toward his minimal state. It would seem that Nozick's minimal state could only impose taxation on the clients it would have had before it became a state, and not on the would-be clients of competing agencies. But clearly, the existing state taxes everyone, with no regard whatever for who they would have patronized. And indeed, it is difficult to see how it could try to find and separate these different hypothetical. Nozick also, in common with his limited government colleagues, treats protection, at least when preferred by his minimal state, as one collective lump. But how much protection shall be supplied, and at what cost of resources? What criteria shall decide? For, after all, the eve of almost the entire national product being devoted to supplying each person with a tank and an armed guard, or we only one policeman, one judge, in an entire country. Who decides on the degree of protection, and on what criterion? For, in contrast, all the goods and services of the private market are produced on the basis of relative demands and cost to the consumers on the market, but there is no such criterion for the protection in the minimal or any other state. Moreover, as Childs points out, the minimal state that Nozick attempts to justify as a state owned by a private dominant. There is still no explanation or justification in Nozick for the modern form of voting, democracy, checks and balances, etc. Finally, a grave flaw permeates the entire discussion of rights and government in the Nozick volume. That, as a Kantian intuitionist, has no theory of right. Rights are simply emotionally intuited, with no groundwork and natural in the nature of man or the universe. At bottom, Nozick has no real argument of rights. To conclude, 1. No existing state has been immaculately, and therefore Nozick on his own grounds should advocate anarchism and then wait for his state to develop. 2. Even if any state had been so conceived, individual rights are inalienable and therefore no existing state could be justified. 3. Every step of Nozick's and process is invalid. The process is all too conscious and visible, and the risk and compensation principles are both fallacious and passports to unlimited despotism. 4. There is no warrant, even on Nozick's own grounds, for the dominant protective agency to outlaw procedures by independents that do not injure its own clients, and therefore it cannot arrive at an minimal state. 5. Nozick's theory of non-productive exchanges is invalid, so that the prohibition of risky activities, and hence the ultra-minimal state, falls on that account alone. 6. Contrary to Nozick, there are no procedural rights, and therefore no way to get from his theory of risk and non-productive exchange the compulsory monopoly of the ultra-minimal state. 7. There is no warrant, even on Nozick's own grounds, for the minimal state to impose taxation. 8. There is no way in Nozick's theory to justify the voting or democratic procedures of any state. 9. Nozick's minimal state would, on his own grounds, justify a maximal state as well. And 10. The only invisible hand process on Nozick's own terms would move society from his minimal state back to anarchism, Thus, the most important attempt in the century to rebut anarchism and to justify the state fails totally in parts. And then next week we're going to get to part 5, called A Theory of Strategy for Liberty. I'm going to say I leave this one to you. We're gonna raid now. We're done. I'm not gonna keep on going. I don't know who's still here, but I'm just trying to. I don't know who else to raid. I'm not gonna look up someone. Yeah, we're getting out of here.